The spring sun lit up the glass walls of Vanderbilt University Hospital like stained glass in a cathedral, scattering golden flecks across the polished concrete. Trees bloomed with white dogwoods and pink magnolias, their petals drifting lazily to the ground in a world that seemed to be celebrating something. But for Michael Carter, sitting on a worn wooden bench outside the ICU wing, nothing could have felt more wrong. The scent of new life clashed painfully with what was unraveling inside. His hands trembled, clasped so tightly that his knuckles turned pale, and for a moment, it felt like even the earth itself had moved on without him. Behind those walls, the man he loved more than anything was slipping away. Julian Carter was a craftsman with splinters in his hands and laughter in his voice. A man who carved beauty from wood and made every corner of their modest home feel like a sanctuary. They had met 8 years earlier. Michael, a nurse with a guarded heart, and Julian, a quiet soul with eyes that didn't look away when things got difficult. Against odds and noise from the world around them, they had made it. 5 years ago, they stood in a courthouse and vowed their lives to each other, unshaken by stares or whispers. Now, Julian lay in the ICU, pale and still, his body failing from a rare and merciless enemy, aplastic anemia. Michael had watched the doctors try everything: transfusions, growth factors, every slim chance thrown their way, but none of it worked. And Julian, who once lifted beams and laughed at storms, was now too weak to even hold Michael's hand. Michael had always trusted science, the careful steadiness of medicine, but nothing prepared him for hearing the words, "We're running out of options." It landed heavier than any diagnosis. They had known from the start that Julian's chances of finding a match were slim. He was adopted, with no records of biological relatives, no blood siblings, no known parents, and without a close genetic match. Bone marrow transplants were rolling dice in a game where the odds were always cruel. That morning, after sitting by Julian's side for hours and whispering empty reassurances, Michael had stepped outside. The hallway had become too tight, the sound of monitors too sharp. He needed to breathe. He needed to not fall apart. He found that wooden bench just outside the south wing, hidden behind a row of blooming tulips, and sat there with his grief. He didn't cry. He couldn't. It was a silence that hurt more than tears. Around him, the world moved on. A mother wheeled her newborn in a stroller past the gate. 2 students walked by, debating dinner plans. Life was going on. Michael watched them, hollowed out by envy. He used to be one of them, a man with weekends and garden plans, not someone marking days in units of platelet counts and white blood cell levels. And as he sat in that numb stillness, a fragment of conversation floated his way. 2 nurses behind him, laughing softly as they walked to their shift change. "You know who I saw at Pine Hollow last week? A guy who looked exactly like that patient in ICU. Carter something." Michael didn't move. His heart punched inside his chest. The voice had already faded down the walkway, swallowed by traffic and birdsong. But the words burned, exactly like Julian. In Pine Hollow, it could have been nothing. Just coincidence, a trick of resemblance, or maybe a mistake entirely. But Michael couldn't let go of it. Because when hope becomes a ghost, you cling to any shape it takes. Inside, Julian was dying, and outside, a stranger might be the only thread they hadn't pulled. Michael didn't know what he would find in Pine Hollow. He didn't know if this voice was a beginning or a cruel detour, but he knew one thing: he had to go. Love sometimes arrives in seasons, and sometimes it waits in silence for you to step out of the hallway and listen. Stay with us on Heart Story for more stories where the smallest voices lead to the loudest changes. Because sometimes what feels like the end is just a chapter turning. Michael left Nashville the next morning before the sun had time to burn off the dew. He had requested emergency leave from the hospital, leaving behind a short note on the counter for Julian's attending physician. It simply read, following a lead, "We'll be back." In his backpack, he packed 1 change of clothes, a phone charger, and a worn photo of Julian taken the first summer they moved in together. Julian had been sanding a bookshelf on their porch, sawdust clinging to his beard, his eyes bright under the midday light. It was the only picture Michael had that wasn't filtered through illness or grief. That photo was now folded between his palms like a prayer. The road to Pine Hollow was long and mostly silent, winding through stretches of farmland, shuttered gas stations, and wooden churches that looked like they hadn't seen a service in years. The air grew clearer as the city faded behind him, but the pressure in his chest didn't lift. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's middle name, where the local diner had the same waitress for decades. It was beautiful in that slow, stubborn kind of way. But Michael wasn't here for beauty. He was here for blood. He started at the town post office, asking gently if anyone recognized the man in the photograph. Then the pharmacy, then the diner. People looked at him with polite confusion or tired eyes, shaking their heads, until an elderly man in the hardware store squinted at the photo and said, "You know, that looks a whole lot like Luke Henderson. Lives out near the old apple orchards." Michael thanked him, his heart thudding with something that wasn't quite hope, but had its shape. He followed the directions down a gravel road that cut through rolling fields. The Henderson farm sat at the edge of a ridge, guarded by a sagging wooden gate and rows of apple trees that bent low with late fruit. Luke Henderson answered the door in flannel, his hands covered in what looked like engine grease. He was tall, lean, and weathered, but there was no denying it. His eyes were the same cool slate blue as Julian's. His expression when he saw the photograph stopped him mid-breath. "I need to ask you something," Michael said, voice tight. "Do you know this man?" Luke didn't respond right away. He took the photo, studied it, and said quietly, "I've never seen him, but I've seen those eyes before." They sat outside as the sun fell behind the trees, a jug of water between them and the kind of silence that doesn't rush. Luke spoke in low tones, slowly unspooling memories he thought were buried for good. He remembered being 5 years old when his mother disappeared for a day and came back empty-handed. No one told him where his baby brother had gone, just that some things aren't ours to keep. He had asked questions, then stopped asking. The years hardened around that gap like a scab that never healed clean. Now, staring at the man in the photo, Luke looked like someone watching a ghost become real. "If he's who I think he is," Luke said, setting the photo down, "I want to know the truth. And if he's my brother, I'll take the test today, tonight, if you can find someone to do it." Michael didn't expect the offer to come so quickly. He had braced for doubt, for anger, for a slammed door, but instead, he found a man who had lived too long with unanswered questions and wasn't willing to let them rot any further. They didn't sleep that night. Michael booked an early morning appointment at a clinic back in the city. Luke insisted on driving behind him, not saying much, but never once hesitating. They drove into the darkness together, two strangers bound by something ancient, unspoken, and fragile. It wasn't hope that carried Michael through the miles. It was something quieter, something like duty, and maybe underneath that, a flicker of belief that even broken families could find a way back through the fog. Some people are born into family, others are lost to it, but sometimes life returns what it once took, just not in the way or time we expected. Because kinship isn't always about memory. Sometimes it's a feeling that survives beyond the forgetting. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as Michael pushed open the heavy door to Julian's room. Luke stood behind him, holding his breath, hands buried deep in his coat pockets as if afraid they might shake. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft amber glow across the polished floor of the ICU wing. Machines blinked steadily around Julian's bed, the quiet rhythm of survival echoing in the small room. Julian lay still, his skin pale against the white sheets, a trace of shadow beneath his cheekbones, but his chest rose and fell. That alone was enough. Luke didn't speak as he stepped closer. He stood at the foot of the bed, his gaze fixed on Julian's face. It was the first time in his life he had looked directly at the brother he didn't know he had, and he didn't seem ready to look away. There were no introductions, no explanations, just a long moment where blood called to blood, and neither man had the language for it. Julian stirred, his eyelids fluttered before slowly lifting, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He didn't speak, but his gaze landed on Luke. For a moment, it lingered, uncertain. Then something in him softened. Julian reached out, his fingers trembling. Luke didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and took his brother's hand. No one said the word family. It wasn't necessary. The test confirmed what the heart already knew: Luke was Julian's half-brother, a nearly perfect match for bone marrow donation. The odds had never been in their favor, but somehow, against every closed door, the one person in the world who could help had appeared, and he hadn't run. Preparations for the transplant moved quickly. Doctors moved with quiet urgency, coordinating schedules and explaining risks. Luke signed the papers without flinching. "Whatever it takes," he said, not as a promise, but as something truer, a fact. In the days leading up to the procedure, the three of them settled into a strange rhythm. Michael stayed by Julian's side, rarely sleeping, always watching. Luke, unfamiliar with hospitals, spent his hours reading quietly in the waiting room or talking softly with the nurses about his rural life and the kinds of wood that held up best in storms. He spoke little about himself but stayed close, as if presence alone could begin to stitch together what had been left undone for so long. The morning of the transplant, Michael helped Luke into the sterile gown. Neither man spoke, but as Michael tied the back, his hand lingered for a second longer than necessary. It wasn't thanks. It wasn't fear. It was a recognition of sacrifice, of courage, of something far older than words. The transplant itself passed in a blur of anesthesia and white-coated precision. Hours dragged. Michael sat by Julian's bed afterward, scribbling notes into a weathered notebook. It had become his ritual, a way to track the small victories that no one else noticed. On the second night, he wrote, "His skin has color again, a blush on the left cheek." On the fourth, he opened his eyes and focused, really focused, for more than 10 seconds. Each note felt like a breath he'd been holding, finally let go. Recovery was delicate, slow, uncertain, but it was happening. Julian's body began accepting the marrow, cautiously but steadily. Fevers came and went. Pain flared and receded. And through it all, Luke remained. He didn't talk much about the surgery. He waved off praise. But whenever Julian was awake, Luke found his way to the chair by the window, where he would sit in the filtered light, carving small shapes out of blocks of scrap wood with a pocket knife. On the seventh day, Julian asked for a glass of water. His voice was a rasp, barely more than breath, but it was the first thing he had said in a week. Michael handed him the cup with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Julian drank slowly, then looked up, not at Michael, but at Luke, and gave the faintest smile. "You're really here?" Luke didn't answer. He just nodded, pressing his lips together to stop them from trembling. Michael turned away then, blinking fast. It was too much all at once, too much grief undone, too much life returning. In medicine, they teach you that healing is not a straight line, that the body resists progress, relapses, surprises. But what they don't teach you is how healing feels when it moves from flesh to soul, when something fractured long before memory begins to knit itself quietly back together. And in that room, surrounded by beeping machines and whispered breaths, healing had begun, not only in Julian's body, but in something deeper, in what had been lost, and now was being reclaimed. The first time Julian stood on his own again, his legs trembled like saplings in wind. Michael stood close, arms ready, but didn't touch him. Julian had insisted he needed to feel that first moment of strength for himself. Luke watched from the hallway, silent, hands in his pockets, a ghost of pride flickering in his expression. Recovery wasn't fast, but it was honest. Every breath Julian took now had weight, every step, a memory in the making. By early autumn, the hospital cleared him for discharge. The leaves outside the window had started turning amber, copper, and flame. Julian wheeled himself out beneath the arch of maple trees. A knit hat tugged over his ears. Michael behind him, and Luke walking slightly ahead. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. Some silences don't weigh heavy, they settle warm on the skin, like sunlight after rain. Within a month, Luke moved into a small guest cottage on the edge of their property. It was meant to be temporary, just until Julian grew stronger, but no one brought it up again. The space between them no longer felt like distance. Luke's hands, once calloused from farming and fixing engines, now found rhythm in carving and repairs around the house. Julian, still too weak to work with tools, sat beside him, sketching new designs in a leather notebook, one Michael had given him back when he first got sick, never knowing if it would be used. Their days became gentle. Luke brought fresh apples from a roadside stand and left them on the counter without a word. Julian cooked simple meals when he had the energy. Michael returned to part-time nursing, slipping into the routine of helping others while watching the life he loved slowly rebuild itself before his eyes. One morning, Luke walked into the kitchen and placed a small wooden box on the table. He didn't explain. Inside it was a pocket knife, worn but still sharp, with the initials R.H. carved into the handle. Julian looked at it for a long time before lifting his eyes. "It belonged to our father," Luke said quietly. "He gave it to me when I was 10. I figured, maybe now it belongs to both of us." Julian didn't reply right away. He closed the box, slid it back toward Luke, and said, "Keep it close. You carried the memory. I'm just lucky I get to meet it." Those kinds of exchanges happened often, quiet, unfinished, yet whole in their own way. The past didn't return in full, but fragments surfaced. Luke remembered a song their mother used to hum while making tea. Julian recalled a faint smell, lavender and old leather, he now realized belonged to her coat. Their childhoods had unraveled differently, unevenly, painfully. But now, side by side, they began to stitch a new version of family. Letters started arriving from Pine Hollow. The pharmacist wrote first, then the waitress from the diner, then a group of local kids who had grown up hearing about the Henderson boy who never came home. Someone sent a painted postcard of the apple orchards in fall. Another mailed a single photograph, Luke, age 5, holding a newborn with a red knit cap, both staring out a hospital window. The town, in its own quiet way, had begun to remember the boy they had lost and the man who returned. One weekend, Michael suggested a short trip. They drove to Pine Hollow together, Julian bundled in layers, Luke behind the wheel. The town hadn't changed much, same crooked gas station sign, same soft swing of willow trees near the churchyard. But this time, it wasn't a place of searching, it was a place of anchoring. They walked through the woods behind the orchards as the sun dipped low. Julian paused often to catch his breath, leaning on Michael's arm. Luke kicked at leaves, explaining how he used to sneak into this trail as a kid. They laughed. Real laughter. Not the brittle kind that breaks under grief, but the round, chest-deep kind that heals. That evening, they built a fire in the yard behind Luke's cottage. No ceremony, just warmth, and the pop of pine logs, and the kind of silence that fills the heart. Michael passed around mugs of cider. Julian leaned into his shoulder, eyes half closed, content. Luke poked the fire, adding a split log now and then, watching the sparks climb like wishes into the night. Julian looked up and said, softly, "I thought I was alone, but I was just waiting to be found." No one replied. They didn't need to. Families are rarely perfect. Some are made in blood, others by choice. But the ones that last are forged in quiet acts, staying, listening, showing up even when the past says you shouldn't have to. And sometimes, healing means not returning to what was, but building gently toward what could still be. The woodshop smelled like cedar and oil again. Julian stood near the back window, sleeves rolled, his hands rougher now, new calluses growing where sickness had once taken everything. Outside, frost clung to the grass, and the trees were bare. But inside, the rocking chair he was finishing caught golden light in its curves. It creaked softly as he tested it, then stepped back, satisfied. He built it for Michael, not because of any occasion, just because he could. Michael had come home late that night from a long shift at the hospital. Julian waited with the chair draped in a linen cloth, grinning the way he used to before life became hospital corridors and whispered prayers. When Michael peeled back the cloth, he didn't speak. He simply ran his fingers along the smooth arms of the chair, touched the hand-carved initials beneath it, M.C., and sat down slowly. It fit him perfectly. Julian stood nearby, arms crossed, pretending not to care. But Michael looked up and whispered, "It's the first thing you've made since you got sick." Julian nodded, a little afraid to believe it. Feels like breathing again. 2 days later, Luke invited them to help clean out the attic of his late father's farmhouse, the same house he grew up in. The place had been empty since the old man died. Julian had hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to sift through shadows. But curiosity tugged harder than fear. The attic was dust-covered, full of cracked boxes and long-forgotten things. Old furniture, faded photo albums, rusted tools. Michael was in one corner looking through a box of baby clothes when Julian opened an old cedar trunk marked with their mother's name, Rachel Henderson. Inside were letters, dozens, some unopened, others water-stained and time-worn, most addressed to no one. One, though, caught Julian's eye. It was sealed, the handwriting faded but unmistakable. On the front for Daniel. His breath caught. Daniel. That was his birth name. The one he had before adoption, before the hospital named him Julian Carter. He turned the envelope over. It had never been opened. They sat in silence as he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the paper. Luke leaned in, eyes sharp with something unspoken. The letter was dated decades ago. My Daniel, if you ever find this, know that I loved you more than I had the right to. When you were born, I was alone, scared, and poor. I couldn't care for both of you. I left Luke with his father, and I gave you to a hospital with better care, hoping someone kind would find you. Every birthday, I came to see you from afar, through fences, through glass. I never stopped watching. I never stopped loving. Forgive me. Mom, Julian didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the handwriting, tracing each letter with a trembling finger. His whole life had been shaped by her absence. But now, even in her absence, there was something left. Not explanation, not justification, but truth, raw and unfinished. Luke stood and paced to the window, his fists clenched, jaw tight. She told me she lost you, that you died. Julian didn't look up. I think she lost herself. In fear, in guilt, maybe both. They didn't talk much after that. There was nothing to fix, only space to carry what they now knew. Grief wasn't a storm, so it was an inheritance. That night, back home, Julian placed the letter inside a wooden frame and set it above the fireplace. Michael wrapped an arm around his waist, resting his chin on Julian's shoulder. I used to think love was a clean line, Julian whispered, but it's not. It leaves gaps. It leaves questions, but it's still love. The next morning, as the sun rose, the three of them stood outside the wood shop. The frost had melted. Light stretched across the sky, soft and golden, warming the chilled earth. Michael held Luke's shoulder. Julian leaned against the doorframe, holding the pocket knife his brother had once thought would stay buried in a drawer forever. 3 men, each carrying a story they never asked for, each still choosing to stay. Have you ever discovered something too late, but just in time to forgive? Share your story in the comments. We read every single one. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more powerful tales where healing begins, where silence ends.